hear from Carol Krumhansl.
Thanks, Dave. Well, I thought this was going to be really stressful, but it's turning out to be a lot of fun, and I really appreciate everything that's going on a lot. So I was at a panic over what to talk about here, and I called my trusted friend, Lola. You all know her as a great trusted friend. And she said, well, why don't you just talk about your book? I said, what about the book? Everyone knows this book, I suppose. I just said, well, why did you write it? And I thought, that is a very good question. So what I'm going to do today is talk about why I wrote that book. And thinking about this, something came to mind, it stuck in my memory from an early review of the book by Henry Schaffer. Some of you may know his earlier work on studying expressive performance in piano. And the techniques were extremely challenging at that time. He had pairs of photocells on each of the 88 keys, and there was a strobe signal that took the information and encoded it in 12 bits on the computer, and then this computer record was hand-coded and then re-entered in the computer. It was a tremendous amount of work to find out exactly which keys of a piano were played, when they were depressed and when they were released, and so on. You may also know him as the advisor of Eric Clark and Neil Todd. But in any case, he wrote a review of my book, and there was this particular phrase in it that really struck in my mind, and I thought I'd come back to it. He didn't think much of the book, as you'll see. In her research, every generalization is meticulously scrutinized from a dozen directions against data. But the theory in this case is a set of rather modest generalizations about basic compositional practice, which is well grounded in the experience of generations of musicians. It therefore seems a kind of overkill to produce so much data and so many experimental paradigms to confirm a theory that is scarcely in doubt. And he goes on to say, however, and this is what struck in my mind, there is another perspective from which to view these studies. These are studies of measurement. Cognitive Foundations makes exciting reading for anyone interested in measurement technique. Well, I read this quote to Jeff, and at just the time I was looking on the computer to try to find an image of Henry Schaffer, and he said, oh, any 19th century British man will do. So this is Benjamin Disraeli. Okay, but in fact, you know, I had come to graduate school in psychology and mathematical psychology. From graduate school in mathematics, I was interested in algebraic topology, and I was interested in geometry, and I was interested in group theory, and so really the kinds of patterns that started coming out of the data were, for me, exciting exercises in measurement. And in fact, in psychology, there was a tremendous amount going on at the time about measurement. In particular, I think Eleanor Rosh's influence had a large influence on me. Her research had a large influence on me. What she was talking about was cognitive reference points within categories. That there's some elements within a category that are prototypical. For example, a prototypical color is red, or color of purple or turquoise would be less prototypical. Prototypical numbers would be 10, 20, and so on, as opposed to 75 or 11. Lines, horizontal and vertical, versus 45 degrees, and so on, robin and sparrow versus penguin. And she did a great number of experiments showing why this is important for understanding the structure of cognitive categories. And so she found that these prototypes are central, or most prototypical of the category. They're most easily remembered, they have shorter names, and they're learned earlier in human development. And they also produced interesting asymmetric similarity judgments, like orange is more like red than red is like orange. And so I thought, well, there's this music parallel. I mean, key establishes a hierarchy of tones and chords, and B, the leading tone, is more like C than the reverse. A 2 is more like a 5 chord than the reverse, and so on. And also, Amos Tversky published a paper. I actually got to read it before it was in press. It was published in Psychological Review, And it's called Features of Similarity. And he was questioning whether psychological data really conforms to geometric axioms of symmetry, minimality, and the triangle inequality. And he proposed an alternative model that says that the similarity between any two objects, A and B, is a function of how many features they share and how many features A has that B doesn't and B has that A doesn't. And if you have more features that A has that B doesn't, then it's less similar to the other B than the reverse. So if you know more about the United States' distinctive features, it's going to seem less like Canada than vice versa. Canadians might be the opposite. He also had these nice demonstrations of how important context was. So in the left, you have 4 faces, and your judgment here is to say the face on the top, which is most like of the bottom 3. And you can see, you probably can't see the numbers, but the left one and the right one are about equal in terms of how often they're chosen. But if you add this nasty one in the middle, then it gets to look a lot like B, and now A looks most like D. So there are these interesting contextual kinds of things that had a kind of gestalt character to them. But I was a student of Roger Shepard's, and he'd invented multidimensional scaling, and I wanted to see if we could, in some way, preserve the basic assumptions of that multidimensional space and still account for these things like asymmetries. So I published a distance density paper, a model in a paper in Psych Review, and it said that the judged distance, that's this d prime, between any two objects is a function of distance in that metric space, the one that follows the metric axioms, plus it's modified by the density of objects around A and the density, or X, I guess, density of objects around Y. So the intuition here is A is not going to seem very much like B because there are all these other things that are like A, whereas B might seem more like A. And so this came out of this representation, multidimensional representation that I had of musical tones. And you can see the ones that are in the sparse regions are the accidentals, and they're attracted to the ones that are in the more dense region. Well, this sort of got me thinking about, well, this can go farther than that. It shouldn't stop here. I should do some more. And so that became the plan for the book. And so there's this diagram in there. I wanted to know all the distances between tones and other tones, between tones and chords, between tones and keys, and chords and chords, and chords and keys, and keys and keys. So that was the project. And I had no idea that it would ever be possible to incorporate all of these in a single geometric representation. So it was really a thrill to see Elaine's thesis when I saw it. Now, obviously, there have been lots of more musical things that have come out of this work, but I'm still really interested in some of these measurement ideas. And Jess Gillard, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right, who's at McMaster, put me onto this way of representing circular data that incorporates asymmetry. So you can follow the color to see how strong something is to something else, and you can follow the reverse by the color coming back the other direction. And I've looked at this matrix. This is table 5.1. There's lots of information in that I still don't think I understand. This is similarity of all tones, E and a key. But if you rearrange the tones on the circle of fifths, then you see that the circle of fifths is an important organizational device for the relationships between tones. Okay, so back to our friend Henry Schaffer. In one study after another, Krumhansl pulls out experimental results that neatly confirm the strong orienting effects of tonality in listening to musical sound. But in one sense, can these scaling exercises explain music theory? Well, I sort of felt vindicated when I saw Brian Heyer's entry in the Grove Dictionary on tonality. A further complication and recurrent tension has to do with whether the term refers to the objective properties of the music, its fixed internal structure, or the cognitive experience of listeners. So I think Schaffer had really missed the point that we were not just measuring what music theorists had measured. We were actually showing that this is the way that people organize musical elements with respect to one another in perception or cognition. And I think it's cognition. And I'll tell you why. And this is something that's sort of a small point, but I wanted to get it out there. In the experiment, if you go back and look at the nitty-gritty of it, this is with Eddie Kessler. We had a 1 chord as a context, we had a 4-5-1 sequence as a context, a 2-5-1 sequence, a 6-5-1 sequence, and a scale. And we did the probe tones for each of these and correlated the results with one another. And they correlated very strongly, except for the scale because there's a pitch proximity effect. So the composite profile that all of you have seen is the average of these 4 contexts. Parncut, Lehman, Large, other people have tried to account for that tonal hierarchy pattern in terms of sensory phenomenon. And what they have done to do that is to make a composite of all those 4 musical contexts before they apply their model. So I really think the convergence between these short schematic contexts in the probe tone profiles, that really points to the direction of cognition rather than a sensory kind of explanation, at least in part. Okay, back to Schaffer. It becomes an explanatory model only when it also describes the processes that construct the representation and transformation in its use. What Krumhansl has to offer is to suggest to people that people learn the statistical properties of tonal music and inform tonal expectancies from these. What muddies the distinction is that the principle can itself be regarded as coding a convention of tonal music established statistically by its use. Thus, it is not a clear issue worth pursuing. Well, I think a lot of people here have been interested in statistical learning and statistical modeling of music, and I think they have shown that this is a clear issue worth pursuing. Nonetheless, I'm a bit concerned at the extensive focus on statistical modeling and statistical learning to the exclusion of other aspects of perceptual organization. And in fact, this is something that I wrote. My book was actually finished in 1984, and there were, I had written this big, long, final chapter to it, and this is a quote from it. This convergence of statistics and the probe tone data. It raised the question of why it is that structures identified by music theorists were reflected so directly in the empirical studies. What features of the music were being summarized in these analyses, and through what processes are they apprehended by the listeners? Why are the structures identified by music theorists reflected so directly in the empirical studies? And while I was casting around in this chapter, and I found, of course, I've been reading Leonard Meyer many, many, many times through his book, and he says styles in music are basically complex probability relationships in which the meaning of any term or series of terms depends on all its relationships with all other terms possible within the style. In another place, that musical styles are internalized probability systems is demonstrated by the rules of musical grammar and syntax found in textbooks on harmony, counterpoint, and theory in general. The rules given in such books are almost invariably stated in terms of probability. For example, we are told that in the tonal harmonic system of Western music, the tonic chord is most often followed by the dominant, frequently by the subdominant, sometimes by the mediant, and so forth. So if someone like Meyer is finding this convergence, maybe it makes some sense, but it somehow still didn't quite sit right from where I was coming from, and often with a kind of Gestalt orientation to things. But there was, at the time, a lot of psychological research on learning that shown a high degree of sensitivity to frequency information, that is how often various stimuli are presented and how often these are paired with favorable outcomes. This sensitivity enables the organism, human or animal, to classify stimuli and to respond appropriately. And I should mention one of my other mentors was Bielesi's stimulus sampling theory. It was very important in mathematical psychology. I was at Cornell by this time, and James Gibson's influence was very strong there. The information is in the stimulus. The organism is so attuned to the stimulus properties, it's unnecessary to hypothesize additional mentalistic constructs. And Egon Brunswick, another kind of ecological psychologist, said, it's essential to understand the statistical properties of stimuli as they occur singly and in combination in the environment. And then I tried to relate it by mind to Neisser's perceptual cycle. Well, it was just too much fun having Carolyn and Mark in the lab then, so it took me a while to get around to coming back to the book, and I also had wonderful discussions with them about everything. But I continued to think about why it is there's this match between the statistics and something that comes in these perceptual judgments, which are independently, even to the point of coming up with a private theory of musical emotions. This is the magical theory of musical emotions. And I put this in because of something David Huron said this morning. Okay. The idea is, it comes from Percy Diaconis, who's a statistician at Stanford, and he talks about coincidences. You get on a plane in Ithaca, you sit next to somebody, and in 3 sentences you find out you know someone in common. You think, oh, that's just so amazing. But then you realize you're coming from Ithaca, you probably went to Cornell, blah, blah, blah. And so the things that seem to us surprising really are much more statistically probable than you think. So if you look at the transition matrices, this is something from a paper with Petri Toivianen and colleagues at Jyväskylä, you can see that this is a transition between tone and tone in the Sami-Yoiks. And it's true for diatonic music as well. You can see how sparse the transition matrix is. Now, I don't think most people would, if you asked them, do you think you'd be able to guess what the next note is? They'd probably say, well, I don't know. But in fact, if they've internalized this kind of sparse coding, then of course, but you have the sense you didn't think you'd be able to do it, but you do it, and maybe that contributes to the emotional response. And as I said before, I'm a little bit concerned how the Gestalt picture behind a lot of this work in Bregman's and Narmer's and many other important contributions to our field, it's sort of fallen in the background. I won't read all of this, but I will read my favorite quote. What takes place in each single part already depends upon what the whole is. The flesh and blood of a tone depends from the start on its role in the melody, Wertheimer. And a lot of the early insights about Gestalt psychology came from music, in fact. Lola and I published a review recently that summarizes a lot of this work. There are 3 tenets, basically. There's tonal hierarchies have psychological reality. They're represented cognitively and play a central role in how musical sequences are perceived, organized, and remembered, and in how expectations are formed. Secondly, they're musical facts. They're manifest in the way the music is written and how its structure is codified in music theory. And thirdly, statistically frequent patterns in the music should, in most cases, be reliable guides to the listeners for abstracting the tonal hierarchy. Okay, let me just jump back a little bit to Meyer and emotion. And I first met him when he came to Stanford. And I hadn't met him, but I invited him to come have lunch with me. This is the first time I was at the Center for Advanced Study and had this little Volkswagen that I bought from a graduate student. I didn't know, but he jumped in and we had lunch, and I told him about the statistical result, the tonal hierarchy. And he looked at me and he said, that's not what I meant by statistics. So I've thought about that a lot over the years. Probability is not the same as expectation. This is quoted from him. Or to put the matter another way, we must distinguish between the facts of probability and the awareness that an individual has of alternative probabilities. The awareness that an individual has of alternative probabilities. Importantly, expectation is characterized by uncertainty and awareness of alternative possibilities. They create tension, as an expected event might be delayed or the antecedent ambiguous. In this case, is the listener actively envisages alternate consequence. And it's that kind of process that I think really is sort of more central to the idea of tension than something that's statistically improbable. Continuing with Meyer, he cautions against mere counting. In the absence of hypotheses about syntactic rules and strategic goals, raw statistical data may lead to meaningless or plain foolish results. The mere collection and counting of phenomena do not lead to significant concepts. Behind any statistical investigation must be hypotheses that determine which facts should be collected and counted. Okay, some of you may have heard my keynote at SMPC, so I will be repeating some of the points there, but more briefly. 4 problems I wanted to mention I see with unidimensional sequential statistics. First of all, there are hierarchical levels in music. Often the most important relationships are to be found in levels other than the facts notated in a score. This presents the formidable methodological problem of developing objective and rigorous rules for defining and differentiating patterns above the level of the foreground note-to-note level. And so I wanted to briefly mention that Narmore's model is hierarchical, and we have done tests on Narmore's model looking for the effects of these higher level implicative relationships between non-adjacent events, and found strong support for that level of analysis. I tried to summarize it this way. At any point you've got at least five bottom-up principles that are competing and contrasting with higher level principles, what you know about the style, what you know about the piece of music, what's going on timbrally, what's going on rhythmically, all these different kinds of things interact. Now, I will just, one more thing from Henry Schaffer's review. He also reviewed Gene's book. And he's talking about the possibility arises of a new form of empirical music analysis. The validity of the concept of micro-expectancy can in principle be tested by experiment. Also, one can perform distributional tests on actual music to see how often the implications are realized as predicted. However, one should be clear about what is involved before investing research time in such an exercise. Well, a lot of us have really enjoyed working with this model and found good support for isolated tones, British folk tunes, Chinese songs, atonal songs, Finnish, the Sami yoiks, and so on. So I'm glad we didn't take his caution very seriously. Obviously, Fred's model is extremely hierarchical in nature as well, and he mentioned this particular point earlier. This is one example of our paper. We used a number of different selections of music, some much more extended than this. If you compute these distances event to event sequentially, this is how badly the model works. That model. And if you take into account the distances that are accrued along the branches of the tree, this is what you get. It's a clear difference. There's strong evidence for relationship between non-adjacent elements. And this is, of course, interesting in connection with language. Natural languages go beyond purely local structures by including a capacity for recursive embedding. He also mentioned this paper by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch, saying that recursion is the only computational mechanism in language, and it's unique to humans. Well, I think our work points to a deep parallel with music and language in that regard. Now, for a long time, I've wanted to do a probe tension experiment. I guess we call it stop tension experiment. So Aaron Isbelin, who joined my lab this year, and I did a stop tension experiment with language. We used sentences from an old paper by Grosjean and Harlan Lane, and they measured the pauses when people are reading these sentences. So after the cold winter of that year, most people were totally fed up. Well, people, when they speak it, tend to pause after the major constituents more than in the middle of the constituents. After the cold winter of that year, the big pause, most people were totally fed up. They showed that these pauses, so it's sort of nice because it sort of fits in with the idea that there's a performance aspect that corresponds to structure. So they came up with a complexity index. So here's how it's computed. The complexity for cold is the cold node plus any that are subordinate to it. For winter, it's this node and all of these that are subordinate to it. And for this year, it's this node and all these. So you get a number depending on how much that last word finishes off constituents. And so this is basically like Fred's model without the numbers on the links. So, Aaron?
After the cold winter of that year, most people were totally fed up.
Okay, and after each word, they would move the slider to indicate how much tension they felt. And we had 5 sentences that had the complexity indices and also the reading times, and got this really nice linear relationship. You could throw in parts of speech, transitional probabilities between parts of speech, and so on, and get a better fit. I'm looking into linguistics and seeing something, a minimalist movement in linguistics that's moving their trees closer and closer to Fred's. So here's something, fairly recent review, label-less trees, specifier-less syntax. So a traditional view would be verb phrases, verb and a noun, and in a dependency grammar, you get rid of these labels up here. These are different forms of representation. This is my idea of how Fred's model would represent it. Okay, second point, probabilities do not remain constant. I'll go over this quickly, and this is again from Meyer saying it's a mistake to suppose that probabilities remain invariant. Bill Thompson and colleague Stainton showed that if you divide music in a corpus into implicative moments where you go to a weaker metrical position, something lower in tonal stability or shorter or equal in duration, that's an implicative thing, and you look to see how many of the principles of the Narmore model are conform to this. They're different in those cases than in the closural case. Third point, designed uncertainty. Designed uncertainty tends to be introduced as music unfolds. We should expect design deviations, delays, and ambiguities to be introduced as systematic probabilities increases. And this is sort of my tension schema that's come out of many studies where we ask people to judge musical tension, and you see this asymmetric pattern, low tension, neutral tempo, and new musical ideas that introduced at the beginning of a section. Tension increases, slower tempo, increased note density, increased dynamics. There may be other things too. And you can think of these asymmetric patterns superimposed on other larger or smaller patterns. Well, I'd be interested in knowing what's going on statistically at different points. If you break up things into the phrases, the section begins, what are the probabilities there? What's the statistics look like? And during this period of high tension, what else is happening there? And then maybe something else for section ends. And I've just dummied in transitions between notes, but it could be anything, chords, it could be expressive gestures and performance, it could be tempo variations, it could be almost anything. But it'd be interesting, I think, to sort of conditionalize the analysis of music in terms of this tension kind of schema. Last point, dimensions do interact. Mark and John Prince recently published this tonal hierarchy analysis where they looked at tonal stability and metrical stability and find a relationship. And moreover, the pitch class distribution and stable metrical temporal positions agreed more with the tonal hierarchy. So you can see conditionalizing things according to other aspects of the music leads to different results. I tested this in a machine learning context where I took Kern representation of themes, C major and A minor, but I also messed up with them so that I randomly reassigned the durations. Now, in this particular model, it's an ADIOS model, stands for automatic distillation of structure. It doesn't know anything. It doesn't know that 4A and 4B are more like each other than any other symbol in the system. And so it's interesting to see whether it can put things together, same duration, different notes, different durations, same notes, and so on, and it does. But if you mess up intuitively, you can see this, if you mess up the durations, you randomly scramble them, If the tonal hierarchy is brought out by the durational information, you get this kind of distribution. But if you shuffle things around, if you scramble these durations around, you get less highlighting. The model, very briefly, was for language. Where is the dog? Is that a dog? Is that a cat? And is that a horse? So is identified as a k-gram, probabilistically more frequent k-gram than a Markov. And so that identifies it as, is that A? And it also finds an equivalence class, things that take the same role in a pattern. So it is put together cat, dog, and horse. And then if in another part of the corpus you have the cat is eating, the dog is eating, the horse is playing, you've got this category, cat, dog, and horse, and it then can make another equivalence class of eating, sleeping, and playing. Anyway, we tested the model. It had more trouble distinguishing novel C major and A minor melodies from each other if it had been trained with the scrambled melodies, the scrambled durations. And it was particularly important for the minor case. So minor may have a special dependency on the durational information. This is hard, I don't know. Sometimes the model will directly pick out patterns like this. That's occurred frequently enough so that that's been identified as a pattern. And that's what you get out of sequential statistics. However, there are other things where you find patterns that are embedded and within equivalence classes, and then that's identified as a pattern at another level. I don't know how what the prospects are for looking at those embeddings, but it could potentially be interesting. And finally, this just shows how if something, this is included in an equivalence class that also has this pattern in it, and so you can see how you can expand a melodic sequence that way. So just to summarize, 4 problems. Music is hierarchical. Probabilities do not remain constant. There's design uncertainty in music, and dimensions interact. And by 1989, Meyer was much more interested in the more technical aspects of statistical analysis, and said in his last book, since all classifications and all generalizations about styles are based on some estimate of relative frequency, statistics are inescapable. This being so, it seems prudent to gather, analyze, and interpret statistical data according to some coherent, even systematic plan. He says, not all the probabilities embodied in music composition are determined by frequency. Some are based upon the nature of human mental processes, ways of thinking. For this reason, one of the preliminaries to a statistical analysis of musical styles may be a description analysis of the constants involved in the psychology of thought. So thanks to everyone for coming, those who worked so hard, Steve, to make this happen, and Lola, and all my mentors, collaborators, students, colleagues, friends, and Davey, and of course, Elaine, Fred, and Bill. Thanks so much.